The summer of 1942 had been nothing short of catastrophic for the Soviet Union. Month after month, German panzer divisions had torn through Soviet defensive lines with seemingly unstoppable momentum. The T-34, once considered the pride of Soviet tank engineering, had proven effective against most German armor, but the Red Army knew that the enemy was constantly evolving, constantly innovating. What they didn't know was that a monster was about to arrive on the Eastern Front, a machine that would fundamentally change the nature of armored warfare and strike fear into the hearts of even the most experienced Soviet tank crews. In the late summer of 1942, Soviet intelligence began receiving troubling reports from partisan units operating behind German lines. Whispers of a new heavy tank, something unlike anything seen before, began filtering through to Soviet command. These weren't the typical exaggerations that often accompanied battlefield rumors. The descriptions were too consistent, too specific. A massive tank weighing over 50 tons, with armor so thick that standard anti-tank weapons simply bounced off its hull. The Soviets had faced heavy tanks before. The Panzer IV had been a formidable opponent, but this was something entirely different. Lieutenant Dmitry Oskin of the 502nd Heavy Tank Battalion was one of the first Soviet officers to receive a classified briefing about this new threat. The meeting took place in a dimly lit command bunker near Leningrad in late August. His superior officer, a hardened veteran named Colonel Petrov, laid out reconnaissance photographs on a wooden table. The images were grainy, taken from a distance, but they showed a tank unlike any in the Soviet arsenal or anything they had encountered before. The briefing was stark and concerning. This new German tank, designated the Tiger, carried an 88mm gun, the same fearsome weapon that had proven devastatingly effective as an anti-aircraft and anti-tank gun throughout the war. The armor on the front of the hull was 100mm thick, nearly twice that of the T-34. The sides were 80mm. Even the rear armor was thicker than the frontal armor of most Soviet tanks. Colonel Petrov's voice was steady but grave as he outlined the challenge before them. Soviet tankers would need to completely rethink their tactics. For Oskin and his fellow tank commanders, this information was deeply unsettling. They had grown confident, perhaps even a bit complacent, with the T-34. It was fast, reliable, and its sloped armor had proven effective against most German tanks at typical engagement ranges. But the Tiger represented a quantum leap in armored warfare. The mathematics were brutal and unforgiving. A Tiger could engage and neutralize a T-34 from over 2,000 meters. The T-34's 76mm gun would need to close to within 500 meters or less to have any hope of penetrating the Tiger's frontal armor, and even then, only with a perfect shot at the weakest points. The first confirmed encounter between Soviet tanks and the Tiger occurred in early September 1942 near the village of Muga, southeast of Leningrad. A company of T-34s from the 502nd Battalion was advancing to support infantry operations when they encountered what appeared to be a single German heavy tank positioned on elevated ground overlooking a crucial supply route. The Soviet tanks, numbering about 8 vehicles, were commanded by Captain Ivan Lyubushkin, a veteran of numerous engagements who had personally accounted for 7 German tanks destroyed. Lyubushkin initially believed they were facing a Panzer IV, possibly a command variant given its unusual size. He ordered his tanks to advance in a standard attack formation, planning to overwhelm the German position through superior numbers and maneuverability. The distance was approximately 1,500 meters when the German tank fired its first shot. The sound was different, deeper, and more powerful than anything the Soviet crews had heard before. The round traveled faster than they expected, and the leading T-34 was struck squarely on the front glacis plate. What happened next would be seared into the memory of every Soviet tanker who witnessed it. The shell didn't deflect as they had grown accustomed to seeing with the T-34's excellent sloped armor. It punched straight through the frontal armor as if it were made of paper, penetrating completely and causing catastrophic damage to the interior. The tank's ammunition detonated seconds later, the turret lifting off the hull in a violent explosion. The crew never had a chance to escape. For a moment, shock paralyzed the remaining Soviet tanks. This shouldn't have been possible. The T-34's frontal armor was supposed to be nearly invulnerable at this range. Lyubushkin's mind raced through the possibilities. Perhaps it had been a lucky shot, hitting a weak point or a manufacturing defect. He ordered his remaining tanks to continue the advance, spreading out to make themselves more difficult targets, and to attempt to flank the German position. The Tiger fired again and again. Each shot was deliberate, methodical, and devastatingly accurate. A second T-34 was struck in the turret, the round penetrating and incapacitating the tank instantly. The crew managed to bail out, but they were clearly shaken, stumbling away from their burning vehicle in disbelief. A third tank tried to use speed to close the distance, zigzagging to throw off the German gunner's aim. It made it another 300 meters before a round struck its side armor. The result was the same: complete penetration, immediate neutralization. In less than 4 minutes, the Tiger had destroyed or disabled 5 T-34s. The remaining Soviet tanks retreated in disorder, their crews experiencing a level of helplessness they had never felt before. For the first time in many months, Soviet tankers felt genuinely afraid of what they might face on the battlefield. Lyubushkin radioed back to battalion headquarters with an urgent report. They had encountered a new type of German tank, and it was unlike anything they had the capability to counter effectively. The psychological impact of this first encounter rippled through Soviet tank units across the entire Leningrad front. Stories spread quickly among the tankers, growing with each retelling. Some claimed the German tanks were invulnerable, that Soviet shells simply bounced off their armor without leaving so much as a scratch. Others spoke of German gunners with supernatural accuracy, capable of destroying Soviet tanks from distances previously thought impossible. The Tiger had become, almost overnight, a source of genuine dread. Soviet High Command took these reports seriously. They understood that allowing fear to take root among tank crews could be as damaging as the Tigers themselves. Orders were issued for immediate tactical analysis and countermeasures. Captured German documents and interrogations of prisoners began to provide more detailed information about the Tiger's specifications, capabilities, and, more importantly, its weaknesses. The reality of the Tiger was both better and worse than the rumors suggested. Yes, it was extraordinarily well armored and armed with a fearsome gun, but it was also slow, mechanically complex, and consumed fuel at an alarming rate. It weighed 56 tons, more than twice the weight of a T-34, which meant it struggled with soft ground and was limited in where it could operate effectively. The Germans couldn't produce them in large numbers. Each Tiger cost approximately 300,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, compared to about 100,000 for a Panzer IV. But knowing the Tiger's limitations and actually exploiting them in combat were two very different things. Soviet tankers needed practical tactics, proven methods that would give them a fighting chance when they inevitably encountered these beasts again. And that encounter came sooner than anyone expected. In mid-September, Lieutenant Oskin's platoon was assigned to support a probing attack near the village of Sinyavino. Intelligence suggested that German forces had been reinforced, but the exact composition of enemy armor was unknown. Oskin had participated in the debriefings after Lyubushkin's disastrous encounter, and he had studied every scrap of information available about the Tiger. He knew that facing one head-on was essentially a death sentence. The only hope was to use speed, terrain, and coordination to get close enough for a flanking shot. The attack began in the early morning hours, with Soviet infantry advancing under cover of artillery fire. Oskin's platoon of 4 T-34s followed behind, ready to exploit any breakthroughs or repel counterattacks. The landscape was typical of the region, relatively flat with patches of forest and the occasional low hill. Visibility was limited by early morning fog, which Oskin hoped would work in their favor. They had advanced about 2 kilometers when the fog began to lift, and there, positioned near a tree line approximately 1,200 meters away, was a tiger. Oskin's heart rate immediately accelerated. His gunner, Sergeant Nikolai Guryev, spotted it at almost the same moment and called out the target, but Oskin already knew that firing from this range would be futile. They needed to get closer, much closer, and they needed to do it before the Tiger's crew spotted them. Oskin made a split-second decision that would likely determine whether his crew lived or perished. Instead of advancing directly toward the Tiger, he ordered his driver to move at full speed toward a small depression in the ground about 300 meters to their left. The T-34 lurched forward, its diesel engine roaring as they raced across open ground. Every second felt like an eternity. Oskin kept expecting to hear the distinctive crack of the Tiger's 88mm gun, to feel the devastating impact of a round that could punch through his tank's armor with ease. They reached the depression without being engaged. Either the Tiger's crew hadn't spotted them yet, or they were focused on other targets. Oskin didn't have time to consider which. He quickly assessed the situation. The depression provided some concealment, but no real protection. If the Tiger crew knew where they were, they could simply adjust their aim and fire straight down into the depression. But it also gave them an opportunity. If they could move along the depression, they might be able to work their way around to the Tiger's flank. Oskin ordered his other 3 tanks to spread out and begin maneuvering independently. The key was to present the Tiger with multiple threats simultaneously, to force the German crew to choose their targets and hopefully create an opening for someone to get in close. It was desperate, risky, and entirely necessary. The Tiger fired, but not at Oskin's tank. One of his platoon mates, Lieutenant Gromov, had attempted a frontal approach from a different angle. The result was predictable and tragic. The round struck Gromov's tank on the turret front, penetrating cleanly and causing immediate casualties inside. The T-34 slewed to a halt, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches. Oskin saw 2 crew members bail out, but he couldn't tell if Gromov was among them. The Tiger's attention was now focused in Gromov's direction, giving Oskin the opening he needed. He ordered his driver to move along the depression at maximum speed while staying as low as possible. They covered another 200 meters before Oskin ordered a sharp turn directly toward the Tiger's position. They were now approaching from approximately 45 degrees off the Tiger's frontal arc, closing the distance rapidly. 600 meters, 500, 400. Oskin knew they were entering what tankers called the death zone. Close enough that the Tiger could easily adjust fire and neutralize them, but still not quite close enough for their own gun to reliably penetrate the Tiger's armor. The German tank's turret began to traverse in their direction. Time seemed to slow down. Oskin could see the massive gun barrel swinging toward them with terrible inevitability. 300 meters. Oskin screamed for Guryev to fire, to take any shot he could get. The T-34's 76mm gun barked, the recoil rocking the entire tank. Through his periscope, Oskin saw the round strike the Tiger's frontal armor and ricochet away in a shower of sparks. No penetration. The Tiger's gun was nearly aligned with them now. In seconds, perhaps less, they would be hit. Then Lieutenant Malinovsky's T-34, approaching from a completely different angle, fired a shot that struck the Tiger's side armor near the turret ring. The angle wasn't perfect, and even the side armor was formidably thick, but it was enough to cause some damage. The Tiger's turret traverse stopped. They had wounded it, though how badly was impossible to tell. Oskin didn't hesitate. He ordered his driver to close to point-blank range, less than 200 meters. At this distance, even the Tiger's heavy armor might be vulnerable if they could hit the right spot. Guriev fired again, aiming for the Tiger's side where the armor was thinnest, relatively speaking. The round struck, and this time it penetrated, punching through the armor and entering the fighting compartment. What happened next would later be documented in Soviet after-action reports as a textbook example of how to engage a Tiger tank. The penetration had disabled the Tiger's main gun and injured at least one crew member, but the tank was still mobile. Rather than trying to finish it off themselves, Oskin coordinated with Malinovsky and his remaining tank to surround the Tiger and fire repeatedly at close range, targeting the vulnerable points they had been briefed about: the turret ring, the rear armor, the engine deck. It took 6 more hits before the Tiger finally stopped moving. The German crew, recognizing that their situation was hopeless, abandoned the tank. Oskin later learned that 2 of the 5 crew members had been seriously wounded in the engagement, while the other 3 managed to retreat to German lines on foot. When Soviet recovery teams examined the Tiger later that day, they were astonished by what they found. The armor was indeed as thick as intelligence had suggested. Several Soviet rounds that had struck the frontal armor had barely scratched the surface, but the side and rear armor, while still formidable, were vulnerable at close range to well-aimed shots. More importantly, the Tiger had several mechanical vulnerabilities. Its complex transmission could be damaged by strikes to the rear. The turret traverse mechanism, while powerful, could be jammed if the turret ring was struck hard enough. This captured Tiger became one of the most important pieces of intelligence the Soviet Union obtained during the entire war. It was carefully transported to a testing facility where engineers and tankers worked around the clock to understand every aspect of its design. They measured the armor thickness at every point, tested different ammunition types against it, studied its mobility characteristics, examined its gun and sighting systems, and documented every weakness they could find. The findings were compiled into a comprehensive technical bulletin that was distributed to every Soviet tank unit. The document was remarkably detailed and honest about the Tiger's capabilities. It didn't downplay the threat or offer false reassurances. Instead, it provided practical, tactical guidance based on real combat experience and engineering analysis. The bulletin emphasized several key points. First, never engage a Tiger head-on at long range. The mathematics simply didn't work in the Soviet favor. At distances beyond 800 meters, the Tiger could destroy a T-34 with ease, while the T-34 had virtually no chance of penetrating the Tiger's frontal armor. Second, use terrain and concealment to close the distance. Speed and maneuverability were the T-34's advantages, and tankers needed to exploit them fully. Third, coordinate attacks with multiple tanks. A single T-34 had little hope against a Tiger, but 3 or 4 working together could overwhelm it by forcing the German crew to divide their attention. Fourth, aim for specific weak points. The sides and rear were vulnerable at close range, particularly the engine deck and the area around the drive sprockets. The turret ring was also a potential target. As a good hit, there could jam the turret traverse or even penetrate into the fighting compartment. Fifth, don't be afraid to bypass Tigers when possible. If a Tiger was positioned in a defensive location and couldn't easily pursue, it might be better to go around it rather than engage in a costly battle. But perhaps the most important lesson was psychological. The bulletin acknowledged that Tigers were formidable weapons, but it also emphasized that they were not invincible. They could be defeated with proper tactics, coordination, and courage. This message was crucial for maintaining morale among Soviet tankers, who would inevitably face Tigers in future battles. As autumn turned to winter in 1942, more Tigers began appearing on the Eastern Front, though never in the numbers that would have truly terrified Soviet commanders. The Germans simply couldn't produce them fast enough, and the logistical challenges of maintaining these complex machines in the harsh conditions of the Eastern Front were immense. But each encounter provided Soviet tankers with more experience, more data, more confidence that they could fight these monsters and win. The battle for Stalingrad provided numerous examples of Soviet tankers adapting their tactics to deal with Tiger tanks. In the urban environment, the Tiger's advantages in armor and gun range were significantly reduced. Soviet crews learned to use buildings and rubble for concealment, to fire from ambush positions at close range, and to attack Tigers from multiple directions simultaneously. The close-quarters nature of urban combat was a great equalizer, and Soviet tankers, who had been terrified of Tigers in open terrain, found that in the ruins of Stalingrad they could fight them on more equal terms. One particularly notable engagement occurred in late November. A platoon of Tigers had been positioned to defend a crucial intersection in the industrial district. Soviet forces needed to capture this position to continue their offensive, but a frontal assault would have been suicidal. Instead, Lieutenant Colonel Vasily Krysov devised a plan that would become a model for urban anti-tank tactics. Rather than attacking directly, Krysov positioned several T-34s in concealed positions with overlapping fields of fire. He then sent a small force of obsolete light tanks and armored cars forward as bait. The Tigers, unable to resist such easy targets, engaged and destroyed several of these vehicles. But in doing so, they revealed their positions and exposed their flanks to the waiting T-34s. The ambush was devastatingly effective. Before the German crews could react, 3 Tigers were hit simultaneously from multiple angles at close range. One was immobilized immediately when a round struck its transmission. Another took hits on both sides of its turret, causing catastrophic damage to the internal systems. The third managed to reverse out of the kill zone, but not before sustaining serious damage to its engine deck. This engagement demonstrated something crucial. Tigers, for all their fearsome capabilities, were still vulnerable to well-planned tactics and coordinated attacks. The psychological tide was beginning to turn. Soviet tankers were no longer paralyzed by fear when they encountered Tigers. They were still cautious, still respectful of the Tigers' capabilities, but they now believed they could fight back effectively. Throughout the winter of 1942 and into early 1943, Soviet tank crews continued to accumulate experience fighting Tigers. Each engagement was carefully analyzed, lessons were extracted, and tactics were refined. The Red Army's approach to armor warfare was evolving rapidly, driven by the harsh reality that failure to adapt meant elimination on the battlefield. One innovation that proved particularly effective was the use of massed artillery fire to suppress Tigers before tank attacks. Soviet commanders learned that even though artillery couldn't reliably destroy a Tiger, it could force the crew to button up, reducing their situational awareness and making them more vulnerable to flanking attacks. Similarly, coordinated attacks with infantry and tanks proved effective, as dismounted soldiers could approach Tigers under cover and attack them with magnetic mines and other close-range weapons. The Soviet tank industry was also responding to the Tiger threat. While the T-34 remained the workhorse of Soviet armored forces, new variants were being developed with improved guns and armor. The T-34-85, which would begin production in early 1944, featured an 85mm gun that was much more effective against heavy German armor. But until these improved tanks arrived in significant numbers, Soviet tankers had to make do with what they had. Individual Soviet tank crews began developing their own techniques and tricks for dealing with Tigers. Some became expert at reading terrain, identifying the best routes for close approach that minimized exposure time. Others specialized in target identification, able to distinguish a Tiger from other German tanks at extreme ranges and alert their comrades before an engagement began. Still others became masters of the ambush, patiently waiting in concealed positions for hours until Tigers moved into killing range. One such specialist was Senior Sergeant Ivan Pavlovich, a T-34 commander who had survived 3 separate encounters with Tigers by early 1943. Pavlovich had developed an almost intuitive sense for how Tiger crews operated. He noticed that German tankers, confident in their armor and firepower, sometimes became predictable in their movements. They would favor elevated positions with good fields of fire, assuming that they could engage Soviet tanks before being engaged themselves. Pavlovich learned to anticipate these positions and set up ambushes accordingly. In one engagement near Kursk in early February, Pavlovich's intuition saved his entire platoon. They were advancing through a series of low hills when Pavlovich suddenly ordered his driver to halt. Something didn't feel right. The terrain ahead was perfect for a Tiger ambush, with a concealed hull-down position that would allow a heavy tank to engage while exposing only its well-armored turret. Pavlovich ordered his platoon to take a different route, adding nearly 30 minutes to their movement time. Later that day, another Soviet tank platoon advanced through the exact area Pavlovich had avoided. They were ambushed by 2 Tigers positioned exactly where Pavlovich had suspected. 3 T-34s were destroyed before the survivors could retreat. Pavlovich's caution, born from hard experience with Tigers, had undoubtedly saved lives. But not all encounters ended in Soviet victories or successful withdrawals. The Tiger remained a deadly opponent throughout 1943 and beyond, and many Soviet tankers paid the ultimate price when they faced these machines. The memoirs and after-action reports from this period are filled with accounts of brave men who closed to near-suicidal ranges in attempts to neutralize Tigers, who coordinated complex attacks under withering fire, who stood and fought when every instinct screamed at them to flee. The spring of 1943 brought the greatest tank battle in history at Kursk, and Tigers played a prominent role on the German side. Soviet tankers went into this battle with a year of experience fighting Tigers with improved tactics and growing confidence. But they also knew they would face Tigers in greater numbers than ever before, and that the casualties would be horrific regardless of their preparations. The Battle of Prokhorovka on July 12, 1943, saw hundreds of Soviet tanks engaging German forces that included dozens of Tigers. Soviet commanders employed the tactics that had been refined over the previous months: close-range engagements, coordinated attacks, use of terrain for concealment, and overwhelming numbers. The battle was chaotic and brutal, with tanks maneuvering at extremely close ranges in an attempt to negate the Tigers' advantages. Soviet tanker Alexander Fadin described the scene years later in his memoirs. He recalled the smoke and confusion, the constant radio chatter as commanders tried to coordinate their units, the distinctive sound of the Tiger's gun firing, the sight of T-34s brewing up all around him. But he also recalled the satisfaction of seeing Tigers destroyed, their thick armor finally breached by close-range shots, their crews forced to abandon their supposedly invincible machines. The battle raged for hours, and when it finally concluded, both sides had suffered terrible losses. The Soviets had lost hundreds of tanks, but they had also destroyed or disabled dozens of Tigers. More importantly, they had proven that even massed formations of Tigers could be fought, engaged, and ultimately defeated through superior numbers and aggressive tactics. The psychological barrier had been broken. Tigers were still feared and respected, but they were no longer the terrifying unknown that they had been in the autumn of 1942. As the war progressed into 1944 and 1945, Soviet tankers became increasingly confident in their ability to handle Tigers. New tank models like the T-34-85, the IS-2 heavy tank, and the Su-100 tank destroyer gave Soviet forces improved tools for dealing with heavy German armor, but the tactical lessons learned in those early desperate encounters remained relevant. Soviet doctrine continued to emphasize aggressive close-range tactics, coordinated attacks, and exploitation of numerical superiority. Veterans of the early Tiger encounters became training instructors, passing on their hard-won knowledge to new generations of tankers. They taught young crews not just the technical aspects of fighting tigers, but also the psychological dimension. They explained that fear was natural and expected, but that it had to be controlled and channeled into effective action. They shared stories of successful engagements and explained exactly what the crews had done right. They also shared stories of failures and analyzed what had gone wrong so that those mistakes wouldn't be repeated. By the time Soviet forces reached Germany itself in 1945, encountering a tiger was almost routine for experienced tankers. They had developed such refined tactics that even relatively inexperienced crews could effectively engage tigers when properly coordinated with supporting units. The monster that had struck such terror into Soviet tankers in 1942 had become just another obstacle to overcome, formidable certainly, but no longer insurmountable. The final irony was that by late 1944, Germany was producing fewer Tigers due to resource shortages and a shift toward the even heavier King Tiger, while the Soviet Union was producing thousands of tanks every month. The qualitative advantage that the Tiger represented had been overwhelmed by Soviet quantitative superiority and tactical adaptation. The weapon that was supposed to restore German dominance in armored warfare had ultimately failed to change the course of the war. But for those Soviet tankers who faced Tigers in those early encounters, the memory never faded. They had looked into the face of what seemed like an unstoppable machine and had found ways to stop it. They had overcome fear through courage and determination. They had adapted, learned, and ultimately prevailed. Their experiences in those desperate autumn days of 1942 had shaped Soviet armored doctrine for the remainder of the war and influenced Soviet tank design for decades afterward. The Tiger tank represented a watershed moment in the history of armored warfare on the Eastern Front. It forced Soviet forces to fundamentally rethink their approach to tank combat, to develop new tactics, and to accept that they would need to pay a heavy price in blood to achieve victory. But it also demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of Soviet tankers, who refused to be defeated by what seemed like overwhelming technological superiority. The stories of these early encounters were told and retold throughout the Red Army, becoming part of the shared experience of Soviet tankers. They served as cautionary tales about the dangers of complacency, as inspiration to never give up regardless of the odds, and as practical guides to effective tactics. Lieutenant Oskin, Captain Lyubushkin, Sergeant Pavlovich, and countless others whose names are lost to history became part of a tradition of courage and tactical innovation that defined Soviet armored forces during the war. When the war finally ended in May 1945, surviving Tigers were carefully examined by Soviet engineers and tankers. Many were shipped back to the Soviet Union for detailed study. Soviet designers incorporated lessons from the Tiger into their own tank development programs, leading to vehicles like the T-54, which would become the most produced tank in history. The influence of the Tiger, and more specifically the experience of fighting Tigers, can be traced through decades of Soviet tank design. The men who fought in those first desperate encounters with Tigers in 1942 had performed a service far beyond the immediate tactical situation. They had discovered that the Tiger could be beaten, and they had developed the methods to do so. They had maintained morale and fighting spirit in the face of what seemed like hopeless odds. And they had proven that courage, determination, and tactical skill could overcome even significant technological disadvantages. Their reaction to their first encounter with the Tiger tank had evolved from shock and fear to analysis and adaptation, and ultimately to confidence and competence. It was a microcosm of the entire Soviet war effort on the Eastern Front. Initial defeats giving way to learning and adaptation, terrible losses balanced by eventual victory. The Tiger had been a formidable opponent, perhaps the most formidable tank the Soviets faced during the entire war. But it had not been invincible, and Soviet tankers had proven that fact through their own sacrifice and determination. Today, Historians still study these early encounters between Soviet tanks and Tigers, analyzing the tactical decisions made under extreme pressure, examining how doctrine evolved in response to new threats, and honoring the memory of the men who fought in those desperate battles. The lessons remain relevant for military forces around the world. That technological superiority alone is not sufficient for victory, that adaptation and learning are crucial in warfare, and that the human factor, courage and determination and tactical skill often proves decisive even when facing superior equipment. The story of Soviet tankers and their first encounters with Tiger tanks is ultimately a story about human resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. It's about ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, forced to confront their fears and find ways to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. It's about the evolution of military tactics in real time, driven by the harsh teacher of combat experience. And it's a reminder that even the most fearsome weapons can be defeated by skilled and determined opponents who refuse to give up, who learn from their mistakes, and who are willing to pay the price for victory. The legacy of those early encounters lives on in military academies and training centers around the world, where the tactical lessons are still studied and applied. The psychological aspects are still analyzed by military psychologists interested in how soldiers cope with overwhelming threats. And the stories themselves continue to inspire new generations with their examples of courage under fire, of tactical innovation born from desperate necessity, and of ultimate triumph over adversity. The Soviet tankers who faced the Tiger in those early, terrifying encounters had written a chapter in military history that would never be forgotten.